Good morning to all of you who are joining us for a time of Bible study this morning. We are very thankful for your presence, and one of our church elders read today a card from someone in Southern California that was expressing support for some of the sermons of late, and that means a whole lot to us. We appreciate your encouragement. We thank you very much. We're just delighted to know that there are others tuning in who are wanting to study from the Bible with us. Let me invite you today as we continue with another sermon in this series on eschatology. If you would open your Bible to 1 John chapter 2, and we'll be starting there in verse 17 in just a moment. 1 John chapter 2. John was one of the apostles. He wrote the gospel according to John. He wrote these three epistles we know of as 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. And of course, he also was the author of the Revelation of Jesus Christ, which we just often refer to as the book of Revelation. And although John's gospel doesn't have the Olivet Discourse per se, John is responsible for giving us many details concerning the Olivet Discourse. And that expansion of the Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, Luke 21 Olivet Discourse is found scattered throughout the book of Revelation. So don't think, well, John wasn't much into eschatology. He certainly was. All of the early writers were, because they were just telling and writing about what Jesus taught and what the Holy Spirit revealed to them. So if you've got your Bibles open to 1 John chapter 2, let's read verses 17 and 18 again. I know George did that for us, but for the sake of emphasis, the world. Now, again, as I often say, imagine yourself on the receiving end of this missive or this epistle. Maybe somebody gets it and stands up before the church and reads it. And you receive this and you're living in a first century setting. If you don't go back in time and imagine yourself in that setting, you will miss much of what is being said. So again, if I could back up and excuse the interruption there, the world is passing away, also its lust. But the one who does the will of God abides forever. Children, John's affectionate term for his those who he helped to disciple to Christ. John says, children, it is the last hour. And just as you heard that Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have arisen. From this we know that it is the last hour. So this morning, and I think I'll be briefer than before, but I'm not sure, and many of you say, quit worrying about it. Okay, I'll try. I want to share with you three particulars about the Antichrist. First of all, and this may be surprising to some of our friends as we try to articulate this particular truth with them, the Antichrist were a plurality of people. I've titled my lesson this morning, Antichrist, plural, past, and poisonous. Sometimes we hear people, sometimes, in my opinion, preachers who ought to know better, who speak of the Antichrist. And sometimes the word is in all caps. And it's got the, as if it's just one, as if it, he or she, whatever the Antichrist is, was some singular entity, the Antichrist. The Apostle John makes it very clear that there was more than one Antichrist. He notes, saying in verse 18 of 1 John 2, many Antichrist, with an S on the end, many Antichrists have arisen. Secondly, now don't jump to the conclusion if we're already on the second point, this is going to be over real soon. I'm just kind of giving you a little bit of a quick introduction here, but we'll expand on a few of these points with a little more detail. Secondly, the rise of the Antichrist was a first century event, meaning that they were a group of people who were anchored in the past. If you've been sitting around wondering, has the Antichrist arisen? You can rest assured that he has, that they have, but that it was long ago, in the days of Jesus. And I only know that because John was one of Jesus's apostles, and he's writing by inspiration. Throughout the centuries, we're living in the 21st century now, so 2,000 years since the time of Jesus and the time of the writing of John. And throughout these 2,000 years, people have scrambled to put together various interpretive approaches to how to read verses like these and how to identify the Antichrist. Some have taken an institutionalized approach, that is, that the Antichrist is some kind of a conglomerate, maybe the Roman Empire. Some would have even argued that it was the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church. Some would argue that the Antichrist was the Third Reich, in the days of World War II. And some would argue that it was the Muslim religion, or more recently here, that ISIS, this group of band of terrorists, that they were the Antichrist. Others have taken what we call a personalized approach to trying to identify the Antichrist, and that is where they try to nail it down and be a little bit more specific. And some have said, I think, with good intentions, but perhaps with just a tad more study needed to ferret things out a little bit better, they refer to the beast of Revelation, which is found in Revelation 13, as being the Antichrist. Or they might say Paul's reference to the man of sin, sometimes also called the son of perdition or man of lawlessness. That's found in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, that he is the man of sin. Some claim that it was one of the Caesars, especially Nero, in the first century. In the Middle Ages, it was Muhammad. During the Reformation, it was a certain pope, sometimes more than one. In the mid-1900s, it was Hitler. Hitler was the Antichrist. And most recently, and you notice I'm not being partisan at all because of the grouping that I'm giving here, President Reagan was the Antichrist. And then it was President Obama. And then surely you know that it was President Trump. And even more recently, Bill Gates has been nominated and suggested as being the Antichrist. I don't buy into any of these interpretations, institutionalized or personalized. The best source, and this should always be, nobody should have to tell us this, the best source for ascertaining the identity of the Antichrist would be to read the text itself. And yes, sometimes that will include the need to read more than just a couple verses. Maybe to read everything you can come in contact with about this subject from the scriptures themselves. There's no need to sensationalize or complicate things. Let's just let the Bible interpret itself. I don't want to go off on a side note on this, but I think sometimes we live in a world where just plain old Bible study is just too boring for some people. They have to have something sensational. It's like Albert. He wants to ride go-karts almost every day. We rode them last year, and he wants to ride them again and again and again. And I just tell him, let's just sit on the back porch and rock a while. He doesn't get too thrilled about that. I know it's fun to do things exciting, and sometimes when we see something that has the sense about it that this could be world-changing and life-altering, if we could somehow capture this message and share it with others, then the tendency there is to bite on the sensational. But sometimes Bible study is not sensational. It's just slow and steady. And it comes at us incrementally, and we just have to really chew on it. And we're like the Apostle Peter, where we read Paul's writings and we say, boy, some of these things are hard to understand. And they are, but we just keep working at it and working at it. Okay, here's my simple summary. To be Antichrist is to be against Christ. That's what the word means, you know. If you're anti something, you're opposed to it. To be Antichrist is to be against Christ. In predicting the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in the year AD 70, Jesus, you remember, Matthew 24 and other passages, Jesus enumerated many things that would take place before that first century generation would pass away. Or to say it another way, that those first century saints would live to see many of these things that he spoke about fulfilled while they were still living. Well, it just so happens that in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 11, Jesus stated, in the days before the fall of Jerusalem, I'm reading that into it, but the context dictates that we get that historical setting, that Jesus said, many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Again, it seems like it's too simple. That I'm telling you that the Antichrist is just false prophets? Well, that's kind of what I'm telling you. I'm telling you that these Antichrists were against Jesus, and sometimes they took the form of being first century prophets, but they were false prophets. So my conclusion is a rather simple one. The Antichrist were first century prophets, but they were false prophets. And it might be fair to take a quasi-institutionalized view of the Antichrist, plural, since they represented a sizable number of first century Judaizers. Now that was a mouthful of a sentence. And some of you might be asking, well, what is a Judaizer? It's not a word that I've invented. You can actually find it in your dictionary. A Judaizer were Jewish zealots, people who were head over heels supportive for the Jewish teachings. They were Jewish, the Judaizers were Jewish zealots who were bent on clinging to the law of Moses, tenaciously so. The dictionary defines Judaize. It's a verb too, you know. Judaize means to bring into conformity with Judaism. Or another part of the definition, to adopt Jewish ways and customs and beliefs. And their message to this first century audience was poisonous because it was working against or working to contradict and undermine everything that Jesus taught and everything that was being taught by the disciples. Several passages in the early section of the book of Acts bear this out, I think. And you might be surprised if you used your concordance, you'd never see the word Antichrist appear alongside any text in the book of Acts. But in my estimation, I'm going to share with you two citations where this is clearly the work of the Antichrist. The first one comes early in Acts. You remember that there were some who were responsible for the stoning of Stephen, often referred to as the first Christian martyr. Did you know that those who were responsible for his stoning were the Antichrist? Look at Acts chapter 6. We'll read beginning at verse 8 through 15, and then there's a little conclusion that there's a parenthetical in the book of Acts that we have to go to another chapter, chapter 7, verse 54 and following to get the conclusion of this story. All of this is in our notes online, so if you want to just pleasantly listen this morning without scrambling here or there, sometimes that's not a bad way to do it. Just listen real intently and then say, I'm going to go home and reread and restudy. Check out every scripture reference and do all of that good stuff. So in Acts chapter 6, verse 11, when it has that word they, you'll notice if you go to my notes today, I have in parentheses the Judaizers. All it says in Acts 6, and I know we're not supposed to add to or take away, but context, sometimes these things are very helpful to us. So they, the Judaizers, secretly induced men to say, they're going to say about Stephen, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. And they stirred up the people, the elders and the scribes, and they came upon him, that is Stephen, and dragged him away and brought him before the council. The council here is the Jewish Supreme Court. And they put forward false witnesses who said, this man incessantly speaks against this holy place. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, these are false witnesses that are making these charges. The charges are really right on, except they're underscoring certain phrases to make it seem like it's a bad thing. They're actually, Stephen is actually representing the words of Jesus quite precisely, but they've added that word that Stephen is speaking blasphemous words. So they're trying to nail Stephen for blasphemy, even though all he's doing is telling the crowd what Jesus himself said. So they went on to say, this man incessantly speaks against this holy place and the law, for we heard him say that this Nazarene Jesus will destroy this place and alter the customs which Moses handed down to us. Nothing false about that. All you have to do is read the Gospels. And then the story concludes in Acts chapter 7 at verse 54. When they heard this, the text says, they were cut to the quick, and they began gnashing their teeth at him, Stephen, and they drove him outside the city. Hebrews 13, verse 13, remember last week we referenced the writer of the book of Hebrews said, let us go to him outside the camp. Here they take Stephen outside the camp, outside the city, and they began stoning him. Why, you say, would these men have done that to Stephen? The reason they did that to Stephen was because they were so anti-Christ. It wasn't just that they didn't like Jesus himself. It was the message of Jesus, and it was the message of the cross, and I'll speak of that just a moment in just a moment. That's what got them, something brought them to a fever pitch. When you start gnashing your teeth, and what was the other expression? They were cut to the quick. What was it that Stephen said that so cut them to the quick and caused them to gnash their teeth? It's that Stephen kept bringing up that Jesus said Jerusalem and the temple are going to be destroyed. And they could not countenance such happening. The second illustration, you have to move forward a little bit to Acts chapter 21, and it begins around verse 17. Now, I think you could be a good Bible student and you could read these passages in Acts and the word Antichrist would have never popped in your mind until now. And now every time you read it, you're going to say, oh, Terry said something about these might be the Antichrist. And I hope you'll take me up on that because I think it's very legitimate reasoning on my part. And I'm eager to share this with you, but also eager for you to share it with others. So the Apostle Paul, who has been engaged in a mission to take the gospel to the Gentile world, he travels to Jerusalem specifically to give a report to James. This is not James the son of Zebedee, it's James the brother of the Lord who has become a leader among the Jerusalem church. And so Paul is going to Jerusalem to give a report to James, and the passage says, and all of the elders of the Jerusalem church, about his missionary efforts among the Gentiles. And so whether James is the one vocalizing this or someone else, but it seems like it might be James, it says that they said to Paul, you see, now listen very carefully here, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They're Jews, but they're Jewish Christians. You see how many thousands there are among the Jews who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. I'm giving you that emphasis with my voice, but it's there in the text. And they have been told about you, Paul, that you are teaching the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children and not to walk according to the customs of Moses. So James says to Paul, what then is to be done? How should we remedy this? In other words, they will certainly hear that you have come here. In other words, that was James's way of saying they're probably going to be here any minute. Therefore, James, one of the leaders of the Jerusalem church, an elder and an apostle himself, he says, therefore, do this that we tell you. We have 4 men here who are under a Jewish vow. I've added the word Jewish there, but the context dictates that it's a Jewish vow that they're about to take. Take them, James said, and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses in order that they may shave their heads, and all will know, everybody will know that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. Period. And then James adds, but concerning the Gentiles who have believed, remember what we told you in Acts 15? That's called the Jerusalem Conference. They came together to decide what's going to be binding on the Gentile Christians. And the leaders of the Jerusalem church, under the guidance of God, came up with a really short list. There's not too many things we have to make binding upon the Gentile Christians. You can go back to Acts 15 and read it. Starting around verse 23, is there sometimes some translation says we give this edict, or this is our final word on the matter. So he wrote and said, concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols. There's one rule. And that they needed to abstain from blood, and from that which is strangled, and from fornication. Of all the things that the Jerusalem elders and the apostles could have deemed have to be taught among the Gentiles, it's just these four things. It says nothing about circumcision. It says nothing about keeping all of the law of Moses. So then it says, then Paul took them in, and the next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each of them. And when the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, remember we talked last week about Demas who had forsaken? The Jews from Asia, just like those in Thessalonica, Asia is a hotbed of anti-Christian efforts. The Jews from Asia, upon seeing Paul in the temple, they began to stir up the multitude, and they laid their hands on Paul, crying, "Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." And all the city was aroused, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut, and they were seeking to kill him. Who were these rabid Jews from Asia? They were the Antichrist. Thirdly, and last of all, these Antichrists, there were many of them. They were first century people. And thirdly, they were poisonous. These Jewish zealots who came from Asia were representative of this larger anti-Christian movement. And when John writes to the 7 churches, he speaks of, to the 7 churches of Asia, he speaks of these people as being a part of the synagogue, Jewish, the synagogue of Satan. I don't know that a stronger term could be leveled against these antichrists than to call them a synagogue of Satan. You can find that in Revelation 2:9 and also 3:9. This chosen phrase, chosen by John, guided by God, this phrase, the synagogue of Satan, not only shows that they were Jewish, but that they were wicked. In 2 of his brief epistles, John describes these antichrists in a little more detail. So I've got about 5 passages I want to share with you just quickly, and then we're going to begin to wrap up here. John says, first of all, in 1 John 2:19, if you're trying to get a profile for who these antichrists are, listen to these definitions. In 1 John 2:19, John says, "They went out from us, but they were not really of us." We encounter other times in the book of Acts where somebody's coming into town and they're claiming, "We're from James, we're from Jerusalem, we're from the church in Jerusalem." Here, John says, they went out from us, they claim to be of us, but they're really not part of us. So don't listen to them. Don't let them use us to add credibility to what they're saying. Secondly, 1 John 2 and verse 22, He says, who is a liar? Now, when you start a sentence that way, you know you're embroiled in a pretty hot discussion. Somebody's calling somebody a liar. And John says, who's the liar here? But the one who denies that Jesus is the Christ. This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and the Son. Now hold on, and we'll help you just a little bit on that one. 1 John 2 and verse 26. John says, these things I have written to you concerning those who are trying to deceive you. So these antichrists are deceivers. They're not speaking the truth. They're trying to be deceiving. He adds to that in 1 John 4 and verse 2, by this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit who does not confess Jesus is not from God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that it is coming, and now it already is in the world. And then one more, a little bit redundant on the deceiver idea. 2 John verse 7, only one chapter in 2 John. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the Antichrist. And we don't have time to develop it as we ought to this morning, but the key phrase here is that these Antichrists are denying that Jesus has come in the flesh, with the emphasis on the term come in the flesh. They're not denying that Jesus was born of a woman, that he walked on planet Earth, that he was a real fleshly being. What they're denying, let me read it to you, because sometimes when I'm in the privacy of my office, I can think these thoughts out better than go spontaneous. Basically, the Antichrist denied that Jesus was the Christ. Let's pause there for a minute. The word Christ means Messiah. The Antichrist denied that Jesus was Israel's Messiah, sent by the Father, and here's the key phrase, and it's my words, but it helps us get a grasp. Full statement now. Basically, the Antichrist denied that Jesus was the Christ or the Messiah, sent by the Father to bring to an end the Jewish age. That's the part they could not buy into. I've written an article today called Beware of the Dogs. I want you to read it as well. And we all, I think, need to broaden our view of the Antichrist, because they were called by a lot of different terms. Sometimes they're false prophets. Remember what Jesus said even early on in the Sermon on the Mount? Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, because inwardly they are ravenous wolves. So sometimes they're called false prophets, sometimes false apostles, sometimes false teachers, sometimes false brethren. Each of these terms I give a reference in the scriptures. They're also called apostates. Now, to be apostate, you have to go away from something that you've been a part of. And that's where John writes and says, they go out saying they're a part of us, but they're not really. They've left the church, in other words. They've left the body of Christ. They're labeled deserters. They're labeled scoffers and mockers. They're also called, and this ties in with our essay on Beware of the Dogs, they're called wolves in sheep's clothing. They're called dogs. Paul says, beware of the dogs, beware of the false circumcision. These are Jews who are misleading people. Sometimes when Paul met with the Jewish elders and In Acts chapter 20, he said, after my departure, some will arise from among yourselves. And he went on to tell them to beware of savage wolves who will come in and seduce others. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 32, Paul said, I fought with the wild beast at Ephesus. If you're thinking of a four-legged critter, stop. Words are used as images. Somebody says, well, they put Paul in the amphitheater. He was in the Colosseum, and he was having to fight. He's just talking about fighting with the Antichrist. And he's called them vicious dogs. He's called them ravenous wolves. Now he calls them wild beasts. And Paul even says in his closing letter to Timothy, he says, I fought with the lion. Again, he's not talking about a four-legged lion. He's talking about an Antichrist, the Antichrist. So here we conclude. The Antichrist, I'm convinced, would have been quite content to pledge their allegiance had Jesus come to secure the future of the old Jerusalem. Had Jesus just come on the scene and said, I'm your long-awaited Messiah, and wait until you see Jerusalem and how strong it's going to be when I put down all these Romans. They would have been the first in line, pledging to die for the Messiah. However, in being put to death in the flesh, Christ himself proclaimed the approaching end of the Jewish age. I don't know if we properly comprehend that. The death of Jesus on the cross. As one of the songs says, quoting one of our scriptures, he could have called 10,000. He didn't. Jesus did not have to die on the cross unless he was going to fulfill the will of God. And God sent him to die to the old so that the new could be raised up in its place. When Jesus spoke about the destruction of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple, or the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, these antichrists became a hornet's nest. I don't know what to compare it to today. Not only did these antichrists resist the new and living way, but they worked overtime to persuade faithful Christians, Jews and Gentiles, to abandon the ship of Zion, that is the church of the living God, and to return back to the ways of Judaism, which the text tells us that world was passing away. I close with one more verse, and this has become one of my favorite verses because to me it has helped me understand so many things. It's in 2 Peter 3. You know that passage about the changing of the world, the end of the world, the end of the old age, the Jewish age. And there it begins in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 3 and 4. And you might find your different translations helpful on this, but mine basically, and I abbreviate just a little bit, it says this: in the last days, not now, but in the last days of the first century, in the last days of Judaism, mockers will come. These are the Antichrist, and they will be saying to you, where's the promise of his coming? Now you got to look at me when I'm saying this. These mockers are coming among the Jewish Christian, Gentile Christian believers, and they're saying, where is the fulfillment of the promise of his coming? Yeah, we heard that he said Jerusalem was going to be destroyed and he would come back. But now they're 35 years removed, and they're pointing their finger in their faces, and they're saying, where is he? He said he would come. He's not here. And they go on to say, look around. Look at Jerusalem. Everything is just like it's always been. There's no Jerusalem that's going to fall. There's no Messiah. That man that died on that cross that day in Jerusalem was not the Messiah. If he was, he would have elevated Jerusalem, not talked about destroying it. Let me stop rather abruptly there and just encourage you to study this more and more. Let's bow together in prayer.